excited for today. This is a follow-on to a conversation we did have a couple months ago about sort of U.S.-China relations, especially as it sort of pertains to technology. My wife works for Oracle. She's learned how to TikTok already. So that's their joke now when they start a meeting, that they have to start creating their own TikTok dances. But excited to have a great group, excited to partner with SupChina for this conversation. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is, and I don't see David on yet. David, are you there? No, David is taking a second to jump on. We'll start, by introducing our panelists. So from SupChina, we have.
Sorry, I'm here. I don't know. I couldn't find, for some reason, some of the buttons were obscured by the early view on the poll. So my apologies.
Okay. So as David mentioned, we do have a poll up. I'll leave that up for just another minute or so for the stragglers coming in. So please feel free, answer the poll. If you have questions, comments, please send them to us in the chat feature. I'll be going through those and trying to pull in as many voices as we can over the next 45 minutes or so. And for those of you who are members who RSVP'd for the member-only session following this, we'll be moving on to that link right around 2 o'clock with our panelists. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to David, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Josh. And I should confess, I was also rather hastily finishing my lunch, but I succeeded in more or less doing that. So yeah, we're very excited to be partnered with SupChina for this session today. It's an urgent session. We've had another one on a related topic very recently, but it's kind of so central to what's happening in tech and the economy and international affairs that it can't be discussed too often. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. They're really a great trio. Edith Young is a partner at Race Capital, which is a relatively recently formed firm led by Alfred Chuang, who is a longtime entrepreneur himself. But prior to that, Edith had been at 500 startups as a partner. She's done a lot of investing in both early stage and later stage companies. She also produces something called the China Internet Report, which is a very widely read annual big picture analysis of what's happening with Chinese technology development. We're really happy to have Edith here. Thank you, Edith. Kaiser Kuo, who is an editor at large at SupChina and a friend of Techonomy. He co-founded the Seneca podcast. He also, aside from being a journalist, a longtime expert on Chinese tech and culture, and a rock musician who is very clearly proclaiming that with his not fake background. That's his actual room in which he works. He was, I think, head of communications, right, at Baidu for some considerable period.
International communications, right?
Yes, international, well, whatever that meant. Anyway, he was a very senior guy at Baidu during some key years of its growth in Beijing. And he has on the ground experience at a Chinese tech company, in addition to being an American tech journalist who is an expert in China. Finally, Graham Webster, who is also a journalist, but is currently doing something slightly broader, although it's very journalistic. He's the editor-in-chief of the DigiChina report, I think it's called, at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. So basically, all three of these people are regularly analyzing and writing about and helping to explain both to investors and the general public and as specialists how this whole world is changing. So we've got real experts here. So I'm going to just dive in quickly. I think I'm going to start with you, Graham, if you don't mind, to ask you to, and oh, I should also mention Drew Ayani, who you can see his name there. He's the head of CDX, which is a Techonomy group focused on digital transformation, and is co-hosting this with me. We will see whether he has a good enough connection to ask a question or two and participate. But I hear your voice. Say hi, Drew.
Thanks, David. I hope you can. Yeah, I hope you can at least hear me. The connection can like yourself.
Yes, it is a little. It is a little blurry. So such is life. Thank you for being here anyway. So Graham.
I will be mute.
All right. Thanks. You sort of are a formal official observer of what's happening in the digital realm between China and the US. I guess we are so, I didn't even get into this whole TikTok situation, which is the most urgent proximate reason why we've decided to do this session now. Obviously, the Huawei thing has been happening for a long time. It's currently really more or less fully blackballed in the US and blackballed as even a customer for key American technologies. But I guess we should start with the TikTok situation. Could you tell me what you think is actually happening there? And what does it symbolize to you?
Yeah, well, there's the simple answer, and then there's a little bit more going on. The simple answer is that the TikTok and WeChat bans are Trump administration distraction BS. That's what they are. It doesn't make sense on the actual case that they try to make for why these things should be banned. But it's good BS because it's effective for them, and it does distract well, and it does interact with some real issues. At the same time that they're threatening to ban TikTok and WeChat over privacy and national security concerns. Those concerns actually exist about technology, but getting rid of these two apps wouldn't fix it. If you cut off TikTok, the case that the administration makes is that US users would get protected from Chinese spies and other personal data abuses. Well, that's just not true, because there's a lot of personal data out there of every American smartphone user going through the app economy and the data economy. And Oracle is part of that, and Google's part of it, and Facebook's part of it. We need broader protections than just banning TikTok to make that defense. And I'll close out on the national security side. There are national security concerns about mass data analysis by various countries and in their intelligence services. Certainly the US does this, and China does it. Any country that has the ability to collect huge amounts of data and analyze it for their national security purposes is going to do that. But to say that that's an emergency right now that sort of existed a few weeks ago when they announced this ban and didn't exist 6 months before that is ridiculous. The long-term issues of data and national security need to be dealt with. But again, targeting these two apps right now, right before an election, and at a time when the Trump administration has trouble proving the point that it's tough on China after a very weak phase one so-called deal, it's a distraction. And I'm sorry that it has to be that cynical, but the reality in this case, I think, is that cynical.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces of that we'll come back to unpack. And I want to go on to Edith next, but before I do, and I'll also go into the results of the poll in more detail after all three of you have spoken, but I think it's worth noting that our final question about which companies people worry about the national security risks associated with, there are only two companies about which more than half of you thought they're really worried about the national security risks. And while Huawei is in the lead with 68% of you, of the more than 100 people on this Zoom being worried about Huawei, interestingly, the only other one that exceeds 50% is Facebook. 58% of you are worried about the national security risks associated with Facebook, which goes to underscore, I think, Graham's point. We don't have a coherent policy. So Edith, do you agree with that? And how do you see it?
Well, I think everyone, like including me, is learning about China. I completely agree with Kaiser. What he's saying, we're all students of what's going on, and no one really know like the inside and out on what's going through these deals, and none of them actually want to comment. And by the way, even though I think Zhang Yiming, which is the founder CEO of ByteDance, is actually really well spoken in Chinese, he had never actually done any international interview with any media outside of China. And in this particular case, I recently wrote an article on SCMP about, you know what, like I have no idea what's going on within this app, but if the US really want to regulate any apps, in fact, doesn't matter if it's Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or WeChat, instead of using executive order to ban an app and force a deal, maybe everything, what they should do is to regulate, do data audit, review the code, have an actual committee and really sort of govern instead of trying to ban. And I think that a lot of things are taking out of proportion, and we have no idea what's going on with these deals. And both sides are not even saying the same thing, who's on what. And I think the administration have no idea, and whatever the wind blows on that day seems like it's better to support of the election. So I'm really sad with what's going on. And I'm not saying that in some sense, obviously, and by the way, David, I don't know if the whole this audience have read, and I think maybe, I don't know, like in 97, David, you wrote an article about you travel with Bill Gates to China and actually talked about at the time how
2007, but yes, yeah, was that 2007, right, yeah.
And it was just a really fascinating read, and sort of compare how Microsoft had learned and actually work with government, and quite successful in my eyes, operating in China. And it's just that Chinese company have never, like TikTok is the first one that American consumer finally, shockingly, love a product that is not made in Silicon Valley. And I think that upset a lot of the internet giant in the US. So in some sense, I think what went through Microsoft and what you wrote about in 2007, a lot of Chinese company is going through that now.
Yeah. Well, actually, the interesting thing about that trip to China with Bill Gates was that he was probably the biggest business star in China, in any industry at that time. He was a superstar, and it was kind of like traveling with a rock star to be traveling around China with him. But the summary conclusion of that article was that Microsoft had a tremendous series of problems succeeding in China, and they finally more or less resolved those problems when they decided to basically do whatever the Chinese government wanted them to do, which was a whole range of things, including supporting entrepreneurship, giving access to their code, which they then gave globally to governments, which was probably not a bad thing. They were pressured most by the Chinese to do, and some other steps. Incidentally, I also took a trip to China with Andy Grove a few years before that, which was also pretty eye-opening. Kaiser, oh, you've got a dog there. Good for you. What's the dog's name?
His name is Pot Sticker.
Pot Sticker, okay. So Kaiser.
Oh, you heard me call his name.
He did. We can have him in the screen. That's all right.
Thanks, Brett.
Well, anything you've heard that you disagree with, and if you have any more light to shed on what's actually happening, I'd be eager to hear it. But also, you recently wrote a piece which you shared with me. I don't think it's published yet, that really tries to take a step back to look at why we are in this state of alarm. And it isn't so much about Trump, it's more about American attitudes, because obviously the Trump thing is separate, and I'm sad to agree that it's highly opportunistic and not methodical. But any response on any of this from you, Kaiser?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, I don't think I've heard a word that I disagree with at all. In fact, I think I'm in emphatic agreement with both what Edith and Graham have said about the situation. There's an interesting comment that was made by somebody to the panelists, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing it, that data privacy isn't the only national security consideration, but also simple economic supremacy is also, in a sense, a national security concern. And I would grant that. I think that's true. And what we've seen, really, the Trump administration tried to do, I mean, there were different approaches to trying to reassert economic supremacy. One would be to run faster, to invest in education, to invest in infrastructure, to have policies that favor actual innovation. The other would be to try to trip the other guy and try to thwart his rise. And I think that it's, well, frankly, profoundly un-American to do it that way, which is what the Trump administration has opted for. And I think that what's clear, not just from TikTok, which is, as Edith pointed out, the first Chinese company to make any kind of a footprint globally. It's not just WeChat, but it's also, of course, Huawei. there is a desire now to see Chinese technology on its knees or prostrate in front of the United States. I mean, that's clearly the idea. You alluded to this this piece that I wrote, and this is something that Graham and I have both talked about before, and that's the idea that a lot of what we see happening is a reaction to things that are really happening globally or in the United States, and not really just about China. I'll let him elaborate on that a bit, but just to your point about, I think what we can look at are a couple of narratives that have really informed American understanding of the relationship between, on the one hand, authoritarian politics, and on the other hand, technology. One of them you might call the sort of emancipatory narrative. It was this idea that held sway for a very long time, from the very early days of the internet through the days when Bill Clinton would proclaim, you can't nail a Jello to the wall. But it was this idea that the internet, digital media more broadly, but specifically social media, it was really when Web 2.0, when social media came around, this idea that it would it was the harbinger of the demise of authoritarianism globally, that all you needed to do was free the internet and the walls would come tumbling down and all, authoritarian regimes around the world would collapse. And that animated our belief. I mean, it was really obvious in the Arab Spring when we gleefully appended the names of various American social media products to the different uprisings that happened, either right before the Arab Spring, say in Moldova in 2009, or later that year in Iran after the re-election of Ahmadinejad. We called Moldova the Twitter revolution. It was the first of many. Ahmadinejad's questionable re-election, the protests that happened afterward were the YouTube revolution. And then when the Arab Spring started in earnest, Tahrir Square in Egypt was the Facebook revolution. We believed that until we didn't. And when we stopped believing it, we flipped completely. There were reasons, right? We saw, well, first of all, the failure of the Arab Spring uprisings. We recognized, of course, the dangers inherent in technology, in our own, the government's role in our own country with the revelations of Edward Snowden. And then, of course, there was 2016, the Russian meddling. And then in 2018, the revelation of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So by that time, by 2016, really, we had flipped. Our narrative then became, technology is not the harbinger of authoritarianism's demise, but it's the handmaiden of authoritarianism. It actually is helping to, repress people around the world. The other narrative is equally insidious. It was this idea that authoritarianism would prevent meaningful innovation, that you couldn't innovate unless you had freedom of information. And I guess it's always puzzled me a bit. I mean, it was frustrating to me working in China for a very long time and realizing that I mean, and I was part of it too. We all joked that C2C meant copy to China. And yeah, there weren't a whole ton, but there was real innovation. We underestimated it back then. And today, again, we've seen this narrative flip where we now overestimate it. For up until 2014, 2015, even 2016, during the presidential race, we had Carly Fiorina, who really ought to know better, going around and saying, what has China ever innovated? Apparently, nobody had WeChat installed on their phones in their audience. But it was really frustrating for me, but it's equally frustrating to see it the other way, how it's flipped. Suddenly, China is eating our lunch. It's 10 feet tall. It's an unstoppable juggernaut. That's preposterous too. And both of these things really grow out of anxieties that we feel about American primacy. We have these kind of sturdy bastions of American exceptionalism that have undergirded our beliefs in ourselves as unique society capable of great innovation. And now we're seeing those things threatened. So it's, as you alluded to, it runs much deeper than that.
Thanks. That is a really good background. Graham, we have multiple narratives about what's actually happening with TikTok, but do you think in any sense, anything that's going on now is actually better protecting the data and the privacy of Americans and its national security?
Well, I mean, yeah, a little bit. It's it's all about the margin. I think that people who, if you get WeChat especially banned in the United States, there's a certain group of people who are going to be better off in terms of privacy, and those people specifically are Chinese people or people with connections to China who might discuss politically sensitive issues from the Chinese government's perspective and bring, you know, abuses and detention and other sorts of pressure down on their family and friends in China. That's a real threat that actually happens and would go away.
You presume, and I'm not disagreeing, WeChat is surveilled very heavily by the Chinese government. So they really do know, if they don't want something to go on and they see it in there, they can find it and act on it.
Right, and then a lot of things happen in group chats where people, you know, report each other. Nobody should be under an illusion that the Chinese surveillance state is not pretty much pervading the WeChat environment. I think TikTok's a little bit different. It's not all kind of independently certified yet, but they've been already, without an Oracle deal, making strong efforts to separate the TikTok operation from the Douyin operation, and to have data stored in the United States and Singapore, and have stricter and stricter controls where, you know, push comes to shove, it seems reasonable to think that the Chinese government could pressure someone to try to get some data about some target. You know, there's a lot of moving parts there. Something could probably work for them, but it's different with WeChat, which, you know, doesn't have this segregated data storage structure in the same way, and it doesn't have the, you know, the same separation of the foreign product TikTok and the domestic product Douyin.
On the other hand, WeChat, I believe the statistic is, has been downloaded 25 or 26 million times in the United States, whereas TikTok has been downloaded well over 100 million times in the US. So TikTok is much more prevalent in the US, and WeChat in general is used by either Americans with close ties to China or Chinese in the United States. I would say that's the general user demographic for WeChat. Edith, I know you're very worried about what we're going to lose, or what we maybe already have lost, with the attitude that the Trump administration is displaying toward China and the actions that it's taking. Can you just talk about what you worry about there from the American point of view?
I think as a U.S. investor point of view, and especially focus on early stage investing, I'm in San Francisco. I actually haven't been in China since January. Can't travel there. I'm not going to for a while because of COVID. I always sort of look at from a startup and investor point of view, and I think what's going on in the TikTok situation is actually quite similar. You know, China blocked Google, Facebook, YouTube, many things, and in terms of operating, so it sent a really strong signal to around the world that a lot of, and now we have a completely different conversation related to immigration ban also, but sent to the world that, well, maybe the US are not quite friendly for any non-American players to be strong in the US. And China always done that, and definitely that's not right either. But what's going on right now is operating. But as an investor, we also look at things that is from an investment point of view, and also from an exit, IPO, and M&A point of view. From an investment point of view, I think, you know, obviously with CVS, none of the Chinese investors are really active in the US anymore. I think 4 years ago, especially 2016, 2017, when I was at 500 Startup, I swear at least half of the audience in a demo day are many Asian and many Chinese want to invest in US startups. And because in comparison, the valuation is actually much cheaper in Silicon Valley compared to China. So that's from an investment point of view. But at the same time, American US VC firms like Sequoia, Matrix Partner, Qualcomm, Intel, a lot of the very strong American VC employers actually set up really strong team in China for many years. And I think they will be there. And I think Sequoia China is raising another big fund right now in RMB. So I think that will continue, and there's no change to that. Another level of what's going on has also turned quite sour this year is with M&A, CV has been blocking. Alibaba want to buy MoneyGram, that's been blocked. And Kunlun bought, what's the gay app? I forgot the name, Grindr. Even the transaction happened, and now they're forced to sell it back. And things like this is going to be difficult, I think, for Chinese company to acquire any US company. And US company, I don't see as much as an acquisition per se, but definitely a lot of joint venture that happen in China quite often. And then with IPO, I think is the biggest loss, I think, in some sense for US investor, not be able to invest in the Ant Group. Even Alibaba is listed in the US, and now Ant Group is going to only list in Hong Kong and Shanghai. And it's just kind of sad to see what's going on and so many different levels.
And I know that is expected by many to be the largest IPO in history, even bigger than the Saudi Aramco in terms of its IPO. So for that not to happen in the United States is it's just a historic change that cannot be good for, not that I'm particularly sympathetic to Wall Street, but there's all kinds of other ramifications of many of the things you were describing. Anybody can jump in on any topic anytime, but Kaiser, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and maybe Graham could comment also, you mentioned that there was a narrative that, I think you mentioned it, I know you mentioned in your article, that China was deeply inferior to the US in technology, and that kind of presumption guided much of US policy thinking and public opinion about Chinese tech, and even some degree technology industry opinion. You don't think that's accurate anymore. Talk about how do you think China is essentially at parity with the US in its ability to innovate and to develop technology for the most part? And where do you see the strengths and weaknesses?
That's a really good question, because I think it doesn't lend itself to a binary answer at all. I think you need to look sector by sector. There are some areas where China has had enormous advantages. I think probably the most conspicuous one is in hardware and in consumer electronics, hardware manufacturing, and other device manufacturing, because it sits in such close, it sits atop, especially if you go to southern China, the Pearl River Delta and Shenzhen, it sits on top of the entire value chain, especially the supply chain. And that allows almost frictionless prototyping and iteration, and really quick. I mean, you can just jump on a rental bike, pedal 20 minutes, and you're sitting with your design OEM, and you're working with them to move product really quickly. If you go to Shenzhen, there are gigantic multi-story sort of superstores where, for example, every part you could conceivably need for a drone, every possibility is there, and you can just immediately. It's a maker's dream to live in a city like that. So hardware, absolutely. I think this isn't an advantage that America any longer enjoys. If you look at, I think there are other areas where China is considerably behind. I think in advanced chip architecture, obviously it's quite far behind. We've seen that laid bare by what happened to ZTE, what's happening right now with Huawei. I think in consumer internet, the very fact that China is sort of hobbled and not able to address an international market or to have a lot of sturdy foreign competition in it is a disadvantage. So I think in general, I would say consumer internet is probably still advantage US, although that's closing. And I think in areas like AI, it's a real mixed bag. I think that American quality still kind of trumps Chinese quantity. In terms of the very, very highest level. But I think, Kai-Fu Lee, one of these rare individuals who has the sort of triple crown title of having been very senior at Microsoft, at Google, and at Apple, is now a major investor.
And a friend of Techonomy's who's been on one of these.
Right. So he's published a book talking about how this is really the age of implementation right now in AI, and that really it's about the neural networks you can bring together and the size of the data, the sort of oceanic amounts of data you can have access to, and that is to China's advantage for various reasons. So it's a mixed bag.
But the key point, I guess, for me would be, if U.S. policymakers, to the degree that we're actually making policy, which could be argued, are presuming that somehow we have fundamental advantages that allow us to essentially freeze our intersection with China, that seems perilous, especially in the present compared to the past. And Graham, anything you would chime in on about this general point?
Well, I was just, one of the things we do at the DigiChina project, really the central thing we do, and it's a collaborative project with lots of contributors, is we translate primary source documents from Chinese tech policy. And our most recent translation, we'll have another coming out today, was of a speech that Xi Jinping gave on science and technology development on September 11 this year. And it really echoed a speech from 1978 that Deng Xiaoping gave. And we have some great analysis that people should look into from several experts on that. But if you listen to Xi Jinping trying to prod and bring along the scientists and technologists, the view is pretty clear from the top of the Chinese government that they've made progress, but they still have a lot of work to do. He says, although our country's basic research has achieved remarkable progress, the gap with the international advanced level is still obvious. The root cause of many bottleneck technological problems, and bottleneck, this is, things that China's industry can't easily get past. The root cause of these problems facing our country is that basic theoretical research cannot keep up, and the source and underlying issues have not been clarified. I mean, they're saying outwardly that on fundamental research, on really groundbreaking leading technology stuff, and this is where semiconductors and other, kind of really advanced, only a few companies in the world can do it type of technologies. In those areas, China has challenges, and in most of those areas, the competitors that are at this world leading level that Xi Jinping is trying to cajole everybody to rise to the challenge, those are largely American firms, and they're also European and Japanese and firms from elsewhere in the world. But the bigwigs here, especially in semiconductors, are U.S. controlled. So I just think it's worth taking seriously. Not literally, of course, sometimes they lie, but when the case they're making is we need to struggle to advance in these technologies, I think that's worth taking seriously. They'd be bragging about it if they'd really started to kick ass comprehensively.
I'm curious if you've given any thought to this, or if anybody else has, and we want to go to audience comments and questions momentarily. And before we do, I'm going to go to just make sure we see the whole poll results. But this idea of NVIDIA buying ARM is interesting because they are a company that you could argue, even though they're technically American, they're in some ways less American than some other American companies. Would that by any chance have any strategic benefit to China, given that ARM is sort of the most open of the semiconductor architectures, and that semiconductor design is China's biggest weakness, and of course manufacturing, which is another problem, which maybe they're able to solve. They can solve both. It just takes a lot of time and money. But is there any element there, or is that just jumping out of something totally irrelevant? Anybody think so? I know I didn't discuss that with any of you beforehand, but it's a big change in the industry if that deal goes through.
Right.
I guess
I don't have a position. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in that, and I've been
stunned you to silence on that. Okay, Paul Triolo. Paul Triolo's got a comment, and he's an expert on this stuff. So, hey, Josh, can you upgrade him to a?
Let me see. I could give Paul at least the.
I don't hear anything he has to say. I think anyone would agree he's somebody
he's fantastic.
Wouldn't be sorry to hear from. So, any comments whatsoever on what we've heard so far? Hey, while you're setting that up, let me just share the poll.
He's here. Paul's here.
Okay, Paul, just give us a second because I want to just go through the poll before you speak. So if you can see, I'm sharing this now. If you look at in this audience, they're very worried about the state of the relations. Definitely. Okay. Should the U.S. ban TikTok and WeChat? This audience overwhelmingly believes no. Should the U.S. deny American technology to Huawei? It's just more of a split, but generally people do not think that should happen. They still believe, you all believe, China could still be an effective tech partner, supplier, and customer for the U.S. despite current tensions. And you do believe, in general, although there's some disagreement there, that if Joe Biden became president, the relations would become a lot better. But then I think it's so interesting looking at these companies. There's a lot of people here who worry about all of these companies in one way or another. But again, Huawei #1, not so much TikTok compared to plenty of others, certainly Facebook a lot more than TikTok. And finally, there is agreement that China is too harsh in not allowing Facebook and Google and others to operate there. So that was just a little to just tie that one up. But Paul, go ahead and say anything that you think we're missing or should be thinking about.
No, I think it's a great conversation. I just wanted to highlight that, you know, I think it's important to note that China and Chinese companies have adopted, you know, world-class best practices and are great. Like Huawei and HiSilicon is world-class at semiconductor design. That's not that's hard to do. They've gotten to that point, but they're a fantastic design company. The problem is, if you from a Chinese government point of view, perhaps, is that they're using U.S. design tools and then they're manufacturing those semiconductors in Taiwan using U.S. semiconductor manufacturing tools. So that's the problem. So the problem is sort of the making the machines that make the machines. That's where China is really far behind in some sense. But but this U.S. actions are probably going to really spur this doubling down in that area. But it's tough, as Graham I think mentioned earlier. I mean, this is a 10-year project. If China's really going to recreate all these value chains, which are global and have taken a long time to develop, it's going to be really costly. And the question sort of is who's going to bear that cost? Western companies certainly will, as they'll lose market in China. And so, I think that the sort of underlying problem is that there is this sense in the US that China wants to be completely free of US technology. And I think the real question is, what level of dependence is sort of acceptable for both sides? Nobody ever really talks about that. It's not to reduce, China's goal isn't to reduce US technology to zero. It's just that they don't want to be as dependent, but they want to get to a certain level. And so in providing subsidies, for example, they've made a lot of people uncomfortable that they're going to disrupt the market-driven semiconductor value chain, for example. But nobody should be surprised that they don't want to be forever dependent on U.S. semiconductors for at 98% and above levels. So the question is sort of what's the appropriate level of dependence, and that's what people should be thinking about, not cutting off or denying but encouraging China to use more market mechanisms, Chinese companies, and reduce those subsidies, and then move slowly to a more logical place in the global value chain that represents the importance of China's market and its capabilities.
Thank you. And for anyone who doesn't know, Paul is at Eurasia Group and well-respected analyst in these matters himself, very well-respected. And I think the interesting thing about your comment, and I'd love any of the panelists to discuss it or address it, is you're presuming, Paul is presuming in what he just said, that some degree of dependence is inevitable. And that's sort of kind of not the way our government is currently talking. There's some kind of, seems to be a meme that somehow we could really cut our ties. Do you guys believe that, do you feel that there is some belief in Washington that maybe we could really do without China technologically, or somehow the economy would be okay if they did without us? Or is it just a matter of figuring out what level of dependence is necessary and healthy?
Well, there's clearly a belief in Washington that a total sort of, autonomy is possible. It's a misguided and foolish belief. It is, I think, as any economist will tell you, one that will lead to just enormous inefficiencies and redundancy. It does not allow all the magic of globalization to do what it was intended to do and had done successfully, with problems, but largely successfully for a very long time. But clearly that belief exists. It's just misguided.
I would just add, I mean, the sympathetic version of that belief is there are people who believe, and they're wrong analytically, but there are people who believe that the United States and China are headed toward a total conflict. And so they take that assumption and work backwards and say, okay, we're going to have completely separate industrial infrastructures. I think that's untrue. And I think it's even untrue if there's going to be something like a Cold War between the two countries that gets really deep. I still think it's unlikely that total industrial untangling is going to occur. But I think that, if you set aside that kind of extremist assumption, there is some strategic logic to getting the amount of separation right. Whether or not you agree that every piece of Huawei gear needs to be banned from the US infrastructure, there are certainly some roles in some networks that ideally would not be given over to a vendor with close ties to a rival government. I mean, nobody is advocating for the U.S. Department of Defense to install Huawei infrastructure for the classified system. I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? So there's somewhere between full integration with all the potential vulnerabilities and the loss of confidence in your own security that comes with that, and total shutout of Chinese technology. There is a right amount that achieves both actual security. It could give decision makers some confidence in their own security vis-a-vis one another. And this works on the Chinese side too.
Yeah.
If Chinese companies and government don't have to depend as much on US tech, they can be a little more confident that their whole place is not dominated by the NSA. So, at some point there's enough separation that everybody can, this is my optimistic take, everybody might be able to go forward and kind of be adults about it, and then get back to fighting over what's fair in markets, and maybe working together on saving the climate, and fighting over ideology and human rights and things like that. But we don't have the security question solved, whether or not China's on the table. All these, especially something like 5G that pervades so many parts of society, and the imagined future of 5G with self-driving cars and medical devices, that's a huge threat surface, or attack surface, I mean, in the cybersecurity sense, and it makes people nervous, and we got to do something to get past that.
National security has just become the single lens now through which so many people view every issue related to China. Who benefits from that, right? We need to think seriously about that without imagining that I'm wearing a tinfoil hat. I mean, we can look for, in whose interest it is that everything, be viewed through this singular lens.
We do have Joy Tan, who's a senior executive at Huawei, in the audience, and she may want to, I think she's speaking up in the chat, so we may invite her to come on in a second just to make a comment. But Edith, I'd love to get your response to any of this issue of, where we could go with dependence. But, and also, I guess I'd be curious whether you think China has done any big things wrong that kind of brought this on itself. And one way I think that it has to some degree is with a lot of IP theft over time that did genuinely lead to tremendous resentment in the American business community, whether it continues or not. And maybe some would argue it does, some would argue it doesn't. But any comments on any of this, Edith?
Well, I think Joy can probably talk more about it, and that's why Huawei is actually taking the U.S. government to court in Texas, right, to prove the fact that this is happening, unless the rule of law rules. And I have I don't study IP laws back on so many years to the point that it happens or not, but I think the common ground, a lot of things, that there's definitely a lot of copying going on for a long time. But instead of going on what's wrong, but I do absolutely, it's sad for me to always kind of pick politics and technology together. There's a lot of good thing, I think, for the last few years. If we turn into a completely separate internet, there's a lot of things we can learn from each other too. And I want to point out, a few years ago, I swear to God, everything that is happening on Facebook Messenger is literally a copy of WeChat. And if you think about it, who wouldn't want to build an app that basically the operating system of your life? Essentially, you hail a taxi, shuffle everything, get train tickets on just one super app. And there's a lot of things that we can also borrow from the West. And it's super interesting in my head. Also, from a fintech point of view, I often say to my American colleague, don't reinvent the wheel. If you want to see the future of fintech, just go to China. It is already there. And in so much sense, if you can imagine, David, you probably have more thoughts than I do around Facebook, is primarily driven by advertising. And it really, when you're driven by advertising as a company, it changed the way that you actually regulate and whatever rule you want to put in around data. But I think a lot of the Chinese company, regardless of Tencent and Alibaba, did a really good job on monetizing through payment and really turn into many financial products to drive ARPU. And in that sense, it's something that I think both sides can learn from each other. And it's just annoying to me that now every single conversation around these companies turn into political, but technology itself, most of the technologists are geeky guys that I talk to, early stage startup. All they want to do is to grow and expand. And TikTok certainly have, create some dramatic ripple effect in what's going on. But the reality is 99% of the Chinese entrepreneurs don't actually care less about US market. And with what's going on now, they're thinking about Southeast Asia, thinking about Europe. They don't even want to come to the US anymore. And that's just sad.
Yeah. Okay. We have about little less than 15 minutes left, and here's what I'd like to do. Josh, there was Michelle had a comment that I thought might be interesting. I don't know how she responded. I think you asked her if she wanted to come on and ask it. If not, we could ask it for her.
Yeah, David, we could bring her on.
Okay, bring her on. Work on that. And then after that, I think we should hear from Joy. But I want to make sure we don't end. One of the things that worries me a little bit about some of this discussion is we're talking about it, all this stuff, as if the U.S. has a coherent policy, which I don't think is the case. And so the question really comes to mind, well, let's look at two scenarios, 4 more years of Trump or a Biden presidency. And what would be the likelihood of ways this situation might evolve in those two scenarios? I hope we can get to that before our time is up. But Michelle, go ahead and make your comment or question, please.
So my comment was that
Identify yourself, would you please?
Oh, sorry. I'm Michelle DiGratello. I lead a geopolitical consulting practice in Washington, D.C. And I've been talking to my clients quite a bit about the tech battle and about the uncoupling or decoupling that we've seen, accelerating between the U.S. and China. And my comment was about the splinternet, right? And I'm saying that because I think we are on the verge or have the potential, if we don't step in and make better policies, right, and stop fearing the boogeyman, I feel like we will end up with 2 separate 5G networks potentially, right? So I understand what Graham is saying, that that's not a good idea and that there's a lot of fear mongering and maybe I'm wearing a tin hat, but I am actually talking to a lot of policymakers currently in Washington who favor this, right? They think that this is a good idea as a check to Chinese, what they fear as the, rise of Chinese, policy and power and, especially economic power. So they are talking about, having this Western version of 5G that doesn't have Huawei or ZTE in it in any way. And then of course, China will have, their, Eastern version of, Huawei ZTE. And for me, I think that's a very, economically challenging situation because it will force manufacturers to decide to take sides and either build those products that are going to communicate with the Internet of Things to communicate with the Eastern 5G or the Western 5G, because it will be, financially and economically cost prohibitive to build for both. Similar to what we saw with VHS and Beta, like they won't talk to each other and they won't be able to, to interact. So that was my comment. And I agree with, with Graham. I don't want to see this. And I do think that there are a lot of people pushing that narrative. But again, I think that is related, that's political. And that's why I say this is a geopolitical, realpolitik type of situation. And, to your point about the Cold War, we aren't buying any Russian stuff, right? I mean, we're not having a great relationship. The Cold War is supposedly ended with Russia, and we're not doing a lot of business with them. So there's a danger.
This is UN week, and I've been involved in a lot of discussions this week about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think any of us would agree it would be really nice if we could make progress toward those. And that kind of comment underscores how hard it would be to do things like that and to really make if we have this splintering, but Graham, just comment. I know this is of concern to you, this general area, quite greatly. Just any observations?
Well, I mean, I kind of two things on the splinternet possibility. I think that very well might be an outcome that satisfies the sort of thought experiment I mentioned earlier about there's a certain amount of separation of tech infrastructures that could give these governments confidence so that they could do something reasonable in the future about climate or other sort of common things and to bring things back toward normal. I mean, it's not going to be normal politics anyway. The US system is not going to decrease its attention, I think, on the human rights abuses and really terrifying stuff that's going on in Xinjiang. I don't think it's going to stop paying attention to, the crumbling of democracy in Hong Kong. I think, we're looking at a tough period, but some types of separation could make the space for solving other problems. It's not my preference that that be the way to do it, but I think realistically, given the way that people are concerned, that's what's there. And lastly, on the climate, I just think, we have to ask pragmatically what U.S.-China cooperation needs to happen for the climate, to avoid the worst catastrophes. There's some cooperation that needs to happen, some competition can happen. But what we cannot have is so much conflict that it just distracts both of these massive economies completely from preventing the worst effects of climate change. And instead they spend time figuring out whatever type of, the future missiles and stuff that we need to spend lots of money on in order to convince ourselves that we could beat each other. I mean, that's the downside. And I don't think we're very far from that type of slip to, global civilizational catastrophe on the basis of this geopolitical kind of 19th century realpolitik thinking. So, I don't have the answer for exactly where to put that knob, but we got to figure it out and realize that going over the limit is extraordinarily costly and definitely more morally objectionable than anything else that we do.
That's a bracing thought, but again, it implies a more holistic understanding of big picture than we seem to be evidencing in our national strategy, unfortunately. But I do think it would be only fair to hear from Joy Tan of Huawei before we wrap. If she could just briefly give any reaction she has to what she's heard or what we're not thinking about or whatever. Please, Joy.
Thank you, David. Huawei has been always part of the conversation. So I just want to clarify some of the things. I understand a lot of people actually have concerns about security related to Huawei. But the fact is Huawei has been in the telecom business for 30 years. We're working with most of the operators around the world, 170 countries, except some of the large operators here in the US. We never had a single cybersecurity related major incident. And the UK government has tested Huawei's equipment for the last 10 years. And they have concluded Huawei has no backdoor in our equipment. So I think what people don't realize is that when Huawei sells the equipment to the operators, we actually relinquish the control on those equipment. The operators have final control on these equipment. So when we need to upgrade or do any issue resolution on the equipment, operators, our engineers, they will use a special laptop and they will get permission from the customer. Every keystroke is monitored by the operator. So Huawei cannot do anything, without their permission. So I think, getting rid of the Chinese vendors will not make the supply chain any safer. On the contrary, there will be actually a higher risk for single point of failure. So I think, that's the cybersecurity side. And there should be the same standard testing all the equipment from all the vendors. And on the economic side, and eliminating Huawei from the US 5G market will probably generate about $200 billion on the total GDP for the next 5 years. That's the research published by a third-party consultant. So I think there should be really a set standard and regulations, and they should be applied to all the vendors to secure the supply chain. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Joy. I would like to just end by asking this question about what happens. What is the chance of more coherence under a Biden administration? I personally worry that there's not as much difference between Biden and Trump as there should be on some of these matters. Who would like to comment on the likelihood that we could, under some scenarios, have a rational policy? I guess that's my question.
So so recently I don't know why I love to read an old article written by somebody else. So Biden actually wrote a really interesting article in 2011 in the New York Times. I'm happy to actually PDF and then send it to everyone. And he wrote about China's success is not U.S. demise. And sort of trace back to when he was vice president, and he actually have quite a bit of interaction with President Xi. And I actually found his comment very understanding. He's not saying like China is right, but he's basically have the attitude is that let's work with them and let's negotiate. And we obviously, from a US point of view, have very strong view from a political, economical, social, IP, everything. But we need to negotiate and make sure that find a way to work together. I think what's happening right now is how can we not work together is the attitude. But instead, wouldn't that be even more interesting for us to put our head together to brainstorm on how we could potentially work together, even though we're not, doesn't necessarily need to be agreeing with each other. And that's hopefully, anyway, I think it'll be interesting to see what happened. But I do found that article, he was a little bit more open-minded than the current administration.
Thanks, Edith. We're really running out of time, but quick comments from either of the other two, or any closing thoughts that we really need to have in mind as we leave.
Yeah, I think for one thing, I'm sure Graham would agree with me here, is that at least the Biden administration believes in anthropomorphic climate change. Anthropogenic climate change. They would try, if they put their money where their mouth is and they prioritize this, that is a very healthy incentive to lower the temperature, as it were, not just globally, but in the relationship with China.
Very good point. Graham, any final thought?
I'd just say, as a very simple matter, one way or the other, a Biden administration will not be as self-defeating as to its own goals as the Trump administration has been. The Trump team goes out and does tariffs on this, which ruin a priority for another thing on that, and you've got the USTR negotiating a deal, and then the president dressing down the USTR in front of the Chinese negotiating team in front of the press in the Oval Office. I mean, that stuff wouldn't happen. I mean, maybe if it did, it would be a huge emergency and everyone would get in big trouble. That's every day, every week stuff in the Trump administration. And a Biden administration would try to coordinate the policy and try not to screw each other. Would they completely back off of increased tensions with China? No. I mean, there is an increased geopolitical pressure as the balance of power shifts. Human rights is a huge issue. All the technological security and social challenges remain unresolved. So we're going to have to resolve those. And all of these things tie in both technology and China all at once. And the solution is not yet known, but at least they're going to try to do it in a coherent way. That's actually a big difference.
If you get elected and are allowed to become president. But thank you all. Thank you for all three of you joining us. Really excellent discussion. So much to discuss, more than we have time for. But I thank you all tremendously for being here. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thanks, everybody.